Chapter 13. Year 884 PXF. Spring. Osmond banked gracefully northward up the coast, skirting the blanket of fog that had begun to stack into a gray wall half as tall as the ironwoods just offshore. His silent wings surfed along the waves of warm air flowing out to sea before they cooled into the impenetrable mist. A contagious, familiar elation filled the matriarch's spirit as he glided over his home waters. To Osmond's left, waves crashed into the massive roots of the ironwood trees arching higher than a 3-story inn. On his right, within the gray bank of icy fog, he could hear the voices of the mist owl colony filled with dozens of generations of his brood. The matriarch dipped Osmond lower to skim just above the rolling surf, gliding through the tube made by a crashing wave, a maneuver he would never have attempted on his own. Cowering in wide-eyed amazement within the matriarch's instincts, he snatched a small fish from the crest of one of the swells and devoured it in 3 bites without missing a wing beat. Osmond let out a cry of appreciation as he smiled inwardly. The matriarch was testing this new young flesh she inhabited, and, Osmond felt, was showing off to the youngster just what she could do in her prime. Ahead of Osmond, a stand of juvenile ironwoods blocked his path, like soldiers marching out into the sea and deep into the fog. Their upper branches peeked out of the top of the thick clouds, like ghostly giants rising from the sea to guard the isle at their back. A dozen wing beats lifted Osmond above the tangled domes of their exposed roots, where he could easily weave between their towering trunks. A quick slalom around their ranks brought him back out over the sea on the other side of the spit of land they anchored themselves to, and into the unchecked, ostentatious majesty of Luminaria. The city sat deep in the protective bay that lay on the other side of the sentinel ironwoods Osmond had passed through. Shooting out hundreds of feet from the curving wall of domed roots that marked the shore was an ancient fallen ironwood tree. Long since petrified by the actions of sun and surf on the minerals in its wood, the felled tree now acted as the port of Luminaria, with berths for ships notched out of its trunk. Only a single upper branch remained from its canopy. The towering spire held a globe of arcane coldfire at its pinnacle, acting as a beacon for ships traversing the ever-present fog enveloping the north side of the Isle of Mornasaran. Osmond glided on his silent wings over 2 Cinderfall schooners docked along the jetty, discharging several dozen exuberant Uldani just arrived from Malissari. A deep longing welled inside Osmond upon seeing the group of older teens from the capital just on the cusp of adulthood, but still entrenched in the wiles of their youth. This was everything he missed, everything he had stolen from himself in the turmoil of his youth, the turmoil he now recognized as self-imposed and unjustified. Osmond was not going to miss this experience again now that he had a second chance to have it. He swung wide around the seaside rail of the schooner and landed. Now for the moment of truth. Osmond visualized everything he had become, everything he had learned about himself, good and bad, scars and all, and willed himself to manifest it into being. He felt an airy fluttering shift within his flesh, and where once a mist owl was perched on the ship's rail, now sat an Uldani man. Osmond felt the cold metal of the platinum coin Alaris had given him resting in his palm. He expected to see the daisy as well, but when he opened his hand it wasn't there. Looking down at his hand, though, and seeing his bare forearms and the raised silvery slashes of the scars there, he remembered what the coin was for, and that he was practically naked, with just his enchanted boots and the tattered remains of his old pants. Osmond was alone on deck, but the knot of passengers from Malissari was just over the opposite rail from him on the pier. They could look his way any moment, so he quickly dove through an open hatch into the hold. Osmond nearly knocked himself unconscious on the low ceiling standing up, still not used to his new height. Around him, the mismatched trunks and crates that filled the ship's hold certainly were the privileged Malissari passengers' belongings. Osmond ducked behind a stack of cargo, out of view of any crew who might come down to begin unloading. After quickly scanning the nearby trunks, he picked one likely to contain clothing and inspected the latches. Finding them locked, Osmond was relieved to discover Talon's iron dagger had returned to his hip, still pushed through his worn belt. He drew it to begin work on the locks. As he began, Osmond paused. The blade was no longer the frost-covered, jagged, icy blade he had felt against his skin in the field with Alarice and Wilfred, but a ghostly gray, long stiletto seeming almost incorporeal in substance. It was a mystery that would have to wait for another time. First, clothes. Osmond hoped the locks were more ornate than functional, as he had neither the tools nor skill to do more than force them open. To his surprise, the ghostly stiletto's blade slipped effortlessly into even the smallest gaps between latch and lid, giving him the leverage to pop the locks with nary a sound. The first trunk was full of elegant dresses, which were far too tailored to their owner for him to attempt to wear. Luckily, the second held an assortment of leathers, tunics, and jerkins that he felt he could make work. The tunics were crafted for someone of slimmer build than even Osmond had been when in the Arnador Guard. However, he found a magenta one constructed with generous extra fabric, a lace-up collar, and removable sleeves. By leaving the sleeves unattached and collar open, Osmond hoped to squeeze himself into it without tearing the fabric. As Osmond went to pull the tunic over his head, he discovered where the daisy Alarice had given him as a token of the Fatesinger's blessing had gone. At first, Osmond thought it had just become plastered to the skin near the bottom edge of his ribcage under his left arm. But he quickly realized it was an incredibly realistic tattoo. Another mystery for later that would have to wait. Although the fit was far from what was intended and pulled across his back, the tunic would have to do for now. Osmond discovered pants to be much harder to find. As much as he would have preferred them, Osmond couldn't fit into any of the leathers he found in the pilfered trunk. Even after multiple attempts, and no matter how he tried, he just could not wiggle them over his more muscular thighs and past his fuller buttocks. Osmond mused that perhaps years as a saldrig hunting big game had indeed manifested a downside when it came to his backside. Disappointed, he finally settled on some loose, dun-colored cotton work breeches. Eyeing his clothes, Osmond felt the familiar keel of self-consciousness rise between his eyebrows on the bridge of his nose, like a swelling pimple needing popping. Banished along with most of his childhood emotions, it had been decades since last he felt that specific emotion's tactile sensation manifest so clearly. It felt more substantial than Osmond remembered, so much so his fingers longed to travel to his face and squeeze out the offending abscess. Whether from its long absence or his new physiology he was still trying to understand fully, Osmond became jubilant in the keel's returned presence. He dove into the awkwardness of his situation and clothes and, while completely unnecessary, even further tousled the mop of unkempt, unruly curls his hair had become to complete his immersion in the ungainly emotion. With clumsy aplomb, Osmond strode back onto the schooner's deck, across the gangway, and out onto the jetty formed by the fallen ironwood where the ship docked. The two groups of raucous temptari, the Uldani term for teens of their age who had yet to tame their emotions, had merged and moved away from the schooners. They were about 20 yards ahead of Osmond and moving down the center of the ironwood trunk where, over the centuries, foot and cart traffic had leveled the surface into a wide path. Osmond's keen eyes focused on some of the individuals to try to get a read of the group dynamic and a possible way to integrate himself with them. Scanning the faces, it struck him how young they all looked. His trials on Kaiflanor had aged Osmond more than the same amount of time should have with his Uldani heritage, but even the eldest-looking among the group ahead looked over half a decade younger than himself as humans measured their years. Osmond then had to shift into an Uldani mindset as he watched the group's behavior. At that young age, the older you looked, the less mature you were with your emotional control. Since an Uldani's physical aging was tied to their emotions, it was highly variable from person to person during adolescence. The first decade of physical development was near the same rapid pace as humans, but as Uldani moved through their early teens and became less volatile in their emotions, that aging slowed. Most Temptari traveled, or were sent by their parents, to Mornasarin in late adolescence, usually in their mid to late teens, once they had some control of their emotions but before they fully physically matured. The purpose of the exodus was for Uldani youths to burn through the myriad of passions that overwhelmed their control so they could re-enter society no longer at the mercy of their unbridled keel. Those who arrived at Luminaria looking older, 18, 19, or even brushing against 20, had been, or still were, the most volatile in their emotional development. The dichotomy made for an interesting adolescence for all Uldani. The most immature leap ahead in physical development, while the more controlled and reserved's aging would slow. Osman had seen both sides of that coin. He had been the smallest for his age before his father's first return. With that shock, Anson's departure and then Tavi leaving him again, Osman's swirling emotions ignited a growth spurt in him, quickly outpacing any children who visited Horizon's End with their parents over the next several years. Osman knew it was not unheard of for Uldani to return to Luminaria to rediscover themselves or wrangle newfound passions or emotions they discovered later in life. Many, after the war, did precisely that. But knowing that he wouldn't have the experience of a young Temptari discovering life on his own for the first time did steal some of his excitement. Osman realized he couldn't just slip in with the group of laughing Temptari before him and recapture what he had missed. The realization, and perhaps walking again on two legs, brought his purpose for being here back to the front of his thoughts. He was here to find out the fate of Riken and fulfill his Cat Malorn. Osman no longer considered that debt one he needed to repay to Talon. Certainly, Talon was the beneficiary, and the Cat Malorn had been invoked by Veronique, but the person Osman had truly betrayed was himself. Osman looked down at the scars on his forearms. His soul may have healed, but healing and forgiveness are not the same. Osman had been so focused on the Temptari and lost in thought he had not fully registered the brazen grandeur of Luminaria that had begun to envelop him. The fallen ironwood tree rapidly grew wider as they approached its roots. The center 2/3 had been carved out into a set of monumental stairs and ramps leading down through the bark and into the heartwood. Along its length and width, interspersed with the complex array of stairs and ramps, were landings as large as the central square of the Trellis Market back in Arnador. At the bottom of the stairs was a breathtaking lagoon the color of the warm, clear waters of Jadenpool. Flanking the central stairs on each side, the original root dome remained, but they had been carved and bonded into staircases arching into the boughs of smaller ironwoods on the shore. From his perspective on the fallen ironwood's main trunk, Osman could see now that the lagoon's surface was well below sea level. Upon falling centuries ago, the rest of the ironwood's root dome must have crushed together, creating a natural levee that kept the sea from encroaching on the socket left behind when the first tree fell and eventually became the lagoon. The familiar tickle of wonder played around Osman's toes and spread to the arches of his feet as he took in all the intricacies before him. An overly wide grin overtook Osman's face at the return of one of his favorite and most nostalgic keel. As powerful and joyful as it was, a different emotion quickly overwhelmed it. Perhaps it was the scale that had made it invisible to him, or that his mind just could not process the enormity of what his eyes were seeing. As he raised his eyes from looking down on the lagoon, he realized the vast mottled brown and green backdrop to the scene in front of him was not the forest, but a single ironwood. Arbor Luminari, the World Tree. The tickling wonder of his toes fell to the background in the presence of the vibrating chill of awe. Its keel raced up Osman's spine, from tailbone to the base of his skull, finally settling as a crackling spark between his shoulder blades. Then something unexpected happened, a sensation Osman had never felt before when experiencing Aw's keel. The crackling spark between his shoulder blades began to expand, lifting off his back. It spread wider and wider until the sparking chill of Awe felt like it was infecting two enormous mist-owl wings sprouting from his back. Panic's keel erupted behind his eyes, causing them to feel like they were inflating and about to burst, dulling the sensation filling the wings, but not erasing their presence. Spinning in circles, Osman manically checked with both hands and aching eyes to see if the matriarch's wings had actually manifested, but they found nothing. Relief washed away panic, and awe burst back to the forefront. Not only for the World Tree, but also for this new expression of Oz Keel. Arching his back, Osmond threw his arms out to his sides, turned his face to the sky, and released a loud "Yeah, woo!" of excitement. The first giggle made Osmond realize he was not alone. He had caught up with the Temptari group, who had also paused to take in the sight of the World Tree, and were now all staring at him. The numb throbbing of a zit sitting between his eyebrows surged back into existence. Maybe Osmond could pass as a Temptari after all.